The current situation between Iran and the United States is serious. It is clearly the most serious situation since our rivalry with the Soviet Union up through the early 1980s. It is serious because we are threatening them with first use of nuclear weapons.
The plan for Iran is targeted military strikes from the air, targeting nuclear facilities to create instability in Iran that would lead to an internal takeover. So it wouldn't need more troops. It's basically what it needs is the will to move forward on it. The Bush administration has the will.
We can see that the administration is doing the same damn thing that it was doing to get us into that horrible war in Iraq. And that is, it's putting out propaganda, it's misleading the public.
Vice President Cheney stood on an aircraft carrier 150 miles off the coast of Iran today to deliver a blunt message. We will stand with others to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons and dominating this region.
Why is the U.S. government trying to start a war with Iran?
Basically, until 1979, U.S. and British oil companies owned most of Iran's oil. In 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, the oil companies were kicked out. Since that time, I think it's safe to argue that U.S. and British oil companies and our governments have felt that that oil really belongs to them and have been trying to get it back. It's a tremendous amount of oil. Oil is not just about the profits that would be yielded to oil companies if they owned the oil, although it is a lot about that. It's also about the global power garnered by who controls the last bits of global oil supply.
2/3 of the world's reserves of oil and natural gas is in the Middle East Central Asian region. The largest is in Saudi Arabia, the second largest in Iraq, and the third largest in Iran. Control of this region has been policy since the U.S. emerged a new world power after World War II. In order to dominate the world, we must control the world's oil, and we must not tolerate countries that show how independence and defiance of the U.S. is possible. Plain and simple, the U.S. agenda is world domination.
Please, Chick, that hurts. Don't do it anymore.
Are you gonna be on my side if I let you up?
Sure, Chick, sure. I'm on your side. Just set me up. I'll do anything you say.
Controlling oil means you have a stranglehold on the world economy, and you have a stranglehold on countries who use oil. Either they depend on it for their economy or they import oil.
The U.S. established business and military partnerships with the dictators in the region. The Saudi royal family in Saudi Arabia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and the Shah in Iran. The countries and their oil were under control, but with Iran and Iraq, control was lost. Something had to be done.
After September 11th, 2001, the United States, the Bush regime in particular, launched a campaign, a sort of an unbounded, unending war for greater empire under the rubric of a war on terror. The architects of that envisioned creating an unchallenged and unchallengeable U.S. empire. These neocon theorists argue that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that without the Soviet Union, without this nuclear-armed superpower confronting the United States, the U.S. reigned unchallenged militarily. And if it did not act decisively, new challenges would emerge and it would go the way of other empires. I mean, the Russian empires collapsed twice in the 20th century. The Austro-Hungarian, the French, the British empires rise and fall increasingly quickly, and people like Paul Wolfowitz, like Dick Cheney, like Lewis Libby were very aware of this. So when September 11th came, they seized on this attack. They felt they had a political opening. Again, once in a lifetime. George Bush writes in his diary that night, this was the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to launch this boundless war to reshape the Middle East and the whole world.
The U.S. invaded Iraq and removed a brutal dictator from power, a dictator that we supported through his worst crimes. Saddam Hussein was our ally until he stepped out of line and invaded Kuwait without our permission, turning him into an instant enemy. To regain control, we invaded Iraq.
Attacking Iraq was a war crime. There are only 2 instances in which war is legal. UN authorization, which the United States didn't have, or an imminent threat. Neither one applied. This was actually under the Nuremberg standards a war crime, the supreme crime of aggressive war. That's what this is. And of course, one of the ways I think the discourse in this country is so corrupted is everyone talks about this war as a mistake. No, it was not a mistake. It was a crime. This was a war carried out for very specific and conscious political and economic objectives. It wasn't an error. It was a crime. And the same situation applies with regard to Iran. An attack on Iran, whatever the level of development of their nuclear program is or isn't, would be a war crime.
The U.S. government is guilty of theft and mass murder. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people have been killed, millions displaced, and 100,000 fleeing Iraq every day in one of the most severe refugee crises on the planet. And a key benchmark for withdrawal is a passage of a law putting ownership of the country's oil into the hands of a few multinational energy corporations.
The only actors at this point that are likely to win the war in Iraq are U.S. oil corporations and oil industry folks. That's because the Bush administration has spent 4 years trying to change Iraq's oil industry from a nationalized model that before the war was essentially closed to U.S. oil corporations to a privatized model where essentially almost the entire Iraqi oil sector would be open to private foreign corporate ownership. And the Bush administration has been trying to do that through passage of a new oil law in Iraq so that an Iraqi government would pass the law would then be legal, and the Iraqi government would then sign contracts with U.S. oil companies, making it all on the up and up. So the slow process has been trying to get in place the right Iraqi government and then get the law passed in Iraq. The law is truly radical. Essentially, it would say before the war, U.S. oil companies didn't have access to Iraqi oil. After the war and the occupation, U.S. oil companies own the vast majority of Iraq's oil. Fairly successful use of a military by the interests of the U.S. oil corporations.
Well, we're only advisors. You make your own laws. But I think you'll find that your new law is a good law.
Gaining control of this Middle East, Central Asian region, knocking down any obstacles, whether they be in the form of anti-U.S. movements or states such as Iraq, Iran, Syria that weren't firmly under U.S. control. Once having done this and gained control of this region, Bush, Cheney, and company felt this would put the United States in a position, it would be a key element of preventing the rise of any challenger to U.S. power globally or regionally. And of course, the two main countries they've been worried about are Russia and China. Now, this is something that these people conceive of as essential to the functioning of U.S. capitalism and to the continuation of the United States' role as the world's leading superpower. This isn't a frivolous or capricious exercise in their view. Now, of course, within the ruling class, there are plenty of people who argue they mishandled it and so on and so forth. But the core view. Now, one of the great ironies here is that the United States went into Iraq, as we all know, on the basis of very naked and blatant lies. There was no intelligence failure. They knew full well Saddam Hussein was not a grave and gathering threat and that he had been largely disarmed. But they felt that Iraq would be a good first step after Afghanistan to establish themselves in the region and from there take on Iran, take on Syria, forcibly crush the Palestinian struggle, strengthen Israel as a regional gendarme, and so on. But the irony is that Iraq has boomeranged. Iraq has actually weakened U.S. power in the region, strengthened Iran's power, and in that way actually added to the necessity they feel to take Iran down.
Now the U.S. government is building the case for another unjust war, this time with Iran. The goal once again is regime change, to reclaim Iran as a client state favorable to U.S. military and corporate interests, including non-opposition to the Israeli government. Like Iraq, we are hearing more stories about Iran supporting terrorism and more warnings not to wait for the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. There are some similarities and some differences, and once again the news media is failing to give us the information we need, preferring instead to act as a megaphone for our government.
It's really important as a first step towards preventing war on Iran that people keep in mind as they hear any rhetoric that's pushing towards war to have a skeptical eye. That the history of buildups to war, not just in Iraq or Iran, is rhetoric that is built on lies, the classic Vietnam Gulf of Tonkin, and just to not buy into it and be prepared for the big lie and be prepared not to believe it. As a great journalist from the 20th century, I.F. Stone said when he would introduce a topic to a journalism class, he'd say, there's two words that you get out of this class, let it be governments lie.
Our country is presented as defending itself against a ruthless enemy, and to do this, we must hide any history that shows what we did to start the fight and how we escalated it until we could appear justified striking back with a crushing blow. Iran is a perfect example, and a war on Iran would amount to terrorism.
Our second goal is to prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Iran is being positioned as the next front in the global war on terror. Despite the PR campaign to convince us otherwise, the U.S. government does not place a high priority on preventing terrorism. Before the recent Iraq war started, there was plenty of intelligence predicting that the war would increase terror, which happened as predicted.
The thing I'm most concerned about is that all these efforts on the part of the United States government are creating an atmosphere which is enhancing terrorism all around the world. There was a study that was done called the Iraq effect. And what he discovered is that the amount of terrorism has increased sevenfold times since the United States has attacked Iraq. Terrorism all around the world. And that's gonna be one of the effects if the United States attacks Iran.
The constant threat of an enemy gets hardliners the support of the population. Remember how most Americans felt on 9/11.
creation sends its love.
When a country is at war, it needs a strong leader who will not appease its enemies. It must convince the population that its enemies are irrational and bent on its destruction. It works for the hardliners in Tehran, just like it works for the hardliners in Washington. This brings us to Ahmadinejad, the much maligned, ultra-conservative president of Iran. As can be expected, his unrepentant, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel displays and defiance of U.S. demands to abandon the nuclear energy program are the media focus for our official enemy.
When it comes to Iran, I think it's important that people keep Iran in perspective. Iran does have real ambitions of being a major power in the Middle East, and that's something to take very seriously. And their current president, Ahmadinejad, is somebody who loves to make provocative speeches and to do some really awful things. Particularly for Jews and for Israel, the conference that was held in Tehran a few months ago, that was essentially a celebration of Holocaust denial. However, Iran tried to sort of tone that down. That's essentially what it was. This is something that really raises people's anger, and is certainly seen in the whole world as very provocative. On the other hand, there is this sense that Iran is a religious fanatic country that is willing to see as even have nuclear weapons fired at itself in order to wipe out Israel, and that's just preposterous. Iran has always been a rational player in world politics, which doesn't mean it's been nice, but it's pursued interests and tried to be a part of the global community. The United States has not been open to that since the revolution in 1979, but most of Europe has, and has been dealing with Iran ever since then.
There's a competition in the region for regional power. So U.S., as we all know, is trying to get footholds in Iraq, and they have presence in Afghanistan and other parts of the region. So there's a competition for who could be, leading or who could be a kind of a regional power, and Iran is trying to be a regional superpower. But I don't think currently they're posing a serious threat to U.S.
Iran has always seen itself on the sidelines of Middle East politics. The vast majority of the Middle East is Sunni, but the majority of Iraq and almost all of Iran is Shia. A notable exception is Iran's Jewish population with full political rights and a seat in parliament. Ahmadinejad is worried about being perceived as aligned with the U.S. As absurd as it sounds from a U.S. perspective, the U.S.-backed Shia government in Iraq looks like conspiracy to others. His audience is mostly the Arab populations outside of Iran. By pandering to anti-Israel sentiment, he tries to present himself as a leader in the Muslim world. Ahmadinejad, a mirror image of Bush in many ways, is also trying to appeal to his base, Iranian fundamentalists and the military.
Israel might be wiped off the map.
He stands up, he says Israel should be wiped off the map.
Wiped off the map.
Eliminate Israel from the face of the earth.
Wiped off the map.
Wipe Israel off the map.
Wiped off the map.
Wiped off the map.
Destruction of Israel.
Israel should be wiped off the map.
Are we going to have to wait until there's a mushroom cloud over Jerusalem?
I think one of the things that we hear about Iran that's misleading is that the president, Ahmadinejad, is said to be really the person who's in charge in Iran. And in point of fact, especially when it comes to foreign policy, it's the Ayatollah Khomeini who's really in charge. And so we get a lot of, the media tends to report when Ahmadinejad says these really crazy things like it wants to wipe Israel off the map. But what it doesn't report is when Ayatollah Khomeini says that Iran is willing to back the Saudi peace plan in the Middle East, which really is a plan to normalize relations with Israel if Israel withdraws entirely from the occupied territories and the West Bank and Gaza, East Jerusalem. We don't hear about that. So we know that we're being set up to demonize, to think of Iran as this horrible country and really to demonize it.
What must be understood is that the office of the President of Iran is not the same as the office of the President of the United States. The media should be focusing on Ahmadinejad's boss, the supreme leader, Grand Ayatollah Khamenei. He has total power over the foreign policy, over the military, and the nuclear program. Also left out of the media campaign is Iran's 2003 offer to President Bush. In exchange for being removed from the axis of evil, a guarantee of security, lifting of the sanctions, and allowing Europe to resume investing in Iran, Khamenei approved an offer to put all outstanding issues on the table. He offered to allow full nuclear inspections, to withdraw support for Hezbollah and Hamas, and to normalize relations with Israel if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories. The offer was delivered to Washington by a Swiss diplomat who was censured for even acknowledging it. The US chose escalation over peaceful resolution. The president of Iran is somewhat of a figurehead, and in order to gain influence, he is trying to appeal to the resentment of America and Israel that is rampant throughout the region. In order to understand this hostility and why Ahmadinejad got elected, and why no leader dares to appear pro-US or even to trust the UN, it is essential to understand the history of modern Iran. For most Americans, the story begins in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. A group of revolutionary university students took over the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 diplomats hostage for 444 days. To help burn this into the American narrative, the news show Nightline was created with a nightly tally of the number of days since the crisis started. But to really understand, we have to go back to 1953, which is where the story begins for most Iranians. This was the year that the US overthrew Iran's democracy and installed the Shah, a pro-US dictator. In 1951, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was the first elected official who was appointed as Prime Minister of Iran by popular demand. He saw that the wealth needed to build Iran was leaving the country because over the past 50 years, its vast oil reserves were under British control at the hands of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later to become BP or British Petroleum. So Mossadegh became hugely popular for nationalizing the oil industry and taking back the oil. Hugely popular at home, but quite unpopular with the British government. Britain took Iran to the World Court over the matter and lost. They tried to hit Iran's economy by blockading the Gulf and halting trade. They tried to convince the US to assist with regime change, but then President Truman was not interested. However, when US President Eisenhower took office in 1953, Britain was able to persuade him under the Cold War pretext that Mossadegh relied on Iran's Communist Party for power. The newly formed CIA was sent to engineer a coup, codenamed Operation Ajax. Iran's monarch, the Shah, returned to power. He had previously been weakened by the new parliament, a short democratic experiment designed to limit his powers. After 1953, he returned fully backed by UK and US power, and the oil was soon flowing under control of Britain, America, the Netherlands, and France. The Shah became increasingly arrogant, opulent, and autocratic over his 25-year rule. He instilled fear in the population with a secret police known as Savak, created by the American CIA and Israeli Mossad, that tortured and imprisoned those who dared to dissent. He crushed all political opposition. Troops were sent to massacre demonstrators. He pushed a white revolution to modernize and westernize the country, giving women the right to vote and other reforms. But ultimately, he served the elites and created a huge economic gap for the poor masses. Powerful religious leaders saw that he was forcibly trying to rid Iran of Islam in a country that was 90% Muslim. One of the Shah's leading critics, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was arrested and imprisoned for 18 months. After his release in 1964, Khomeini was sent into exile for 14 years. From abroad, he continued his anti-US, anti-Shah campaign through sermons on cassette tapes that made their way back into Iran and circulated as people copied and shared them. By the end of the 1970s, things had gotten so bad that major protests and the violence that followed were becoming a regular occurrence. The Shah declared martial law and banned demonstrations. This resulted in a huge protest and a general strike that shut down the economy. Soon over 2 million people flooded a public square in Tehran, demanding to remove the Shah and for Khomeini to return, and that is exactly what happened. One important thing to note is that the CIA orchestrated the 1953 coup out of the very same American embassy in Tehran that was later the site of the hostage crisis, right after the Shah was overthrown by popular revolution in 1979. The students were convinced that once again, the U.S. had plans to overthrow their revolution. In fact, U.S. President Carter did send a NATO general to instigate a military coup, but it failed. Iran and the U.S. had an extradition treaty in force that obligated the Carter administration to return the Shah to Iran as an indicted criminal. The students had 4 demands: return the Shah to Iran for trial. He had been accepted into America for medical treatment. Return the Shah's wealth to the Iranian people. A promise from the U.S. not to interfere in Iran's affairs in the future. And an apology and admission of guilt by the U.S. for its past actions in Iran. The apology never came, but 20 years later, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright did acknowledge the U.S. role in Mossadegh's overthrow. So Khomeini took power in 1979 and instituted a government under Islamic law. Within a year of the revolution, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran without provocation, seeking control of Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan region and key oil shipping waterways. The resulting Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 was the longest and one of the most devastating conventional wars of the century. At least 500,000 Iranians were killed. This war further cemented resentment of the U.S. government as they were playing both sides. On one hand, they were supporting Iraq, providing money, technology, and intelligence, including satellite photography, to help Iraqi bombing raids. The U.S. helped provide Saddam Hussein with weapons by giving him agricultural credits and pressuring Gulf states to give him billions in loans so he could buy weapons from Western Europe, China, and Russia. The U.S. Department of Commerce issued licenses to export materials for Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. The U.S. continued its support even after learning that Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran, not to mention against its own citizens, to stop an uprising of Kurdish separatists. But the imperialist tradition also called for maintaining regional balance of power. So the U.S. also armed Iran, not letting any one regional power get secure enough to dominate or to ally with its neighbors to challenge U.S. hegemony. In this case, it came in the form of the Iran-Contra scandal. U.S. President Reagan needed money to fund an unjustified war against Nicaragua, but was forbidden to do so by Congress. So U.S. arms were illegally sold to Iran through Israel and South Africa, and the proceeds went to the Nicaraguan Contras. This allowed Reagan to get around Congress to support a campaign of kidnap, rape, torture, and murder for which the U.S. was convicted by the World Court for unlawful use of force. In other words, state-sponsored international terrorism. The ruling was ignored. Khomeini died in 1989, shortly after the war ended. He promised democracy, but essentially had become the next dictator. Although he improved literacy and much-needed healthcare for the masses, he also imposed censorship, violently crushed political dissent, and attacked women's rights. Instead of the Savak, the people now had the Revolutionary Guard to fear. Since then, Iran has been an oppressive theocracy. Khomeini was replaced by Khamenei, who remains supreme leader to this day.
Yes, I think Iranian government is dangerous. It's dangerous mainly to people living inside Iran. They've been oppressing people. The current government is kind of a dictatorship, and they've done a lot of bad things to Iranian people.
Iran is an Islamic republic that suppresses women. It suppresses movements for free speech. It's an oppressive government, and it is absolutely. And U.S. intervention is going to make it worse. It's made it worse in Iraq. It's made it worse in other contexts, and it's absolutely going to make it worse in Iran.
The United States does not oppose the Islamic Republic because it's reactionary or repressive. All we need to do is look across the Persian Gulf to Saudi Arabia and understand that the United States has no trouble supporting reactionary, oppressive theocracies as long as they do the U.S.'s bidding. And we've seen in Iraq, did the United States bring freedom and liberation to Iraq? No, they succeeded in killing an estimated 650,000 people, making refugees out of 3 million, destroying the country, and actually strengthening the hand of Islamic fundamentalist Shias who want to impose their own theocracy in Iraq. So it's increased the nightmare of the Iraqi people. The Islamic Republic is a repressive regime. I was in Iran in 1979 and 1980 and saw this Islamic theocracy being consolidated. And many of my friends were killed or tortured, put in prison because they were secular opponents of both imperialism but also of religious rule. Certainly women are being mistreated and held in a subservient position. Science is undermined by this sort of theocratic rule. Now, having said that, so this isn't a regime that I like, but having said that, I'm still fully opposed to any U.S. attack on Iran. The fact that the Islamic Republic is a reactionary, repressive regime does not give the United States the right to attack Iran. The future of Iran should be determined by the Iranian people.
Iran has the democracy at the grassroots, and is very strong. It's just like coal under the ashes right now, that it's basically it's about to become a massive movement. And interesting is that the women's movement is very strong against inequalities in Iran and also against gender apartheid. The student movement is very strong. The workers movement also is going very strong, getting unions, and they basically intellectuals, writers, poets. It's so vibrant that you don't see this kind of grassroots movement for democracy in any other neighboring country. So once the threat of bombing Iran comes from administration at this stage, it basically allows radicals that are basically a very small percentage that holding to the power to clamp down on all these movements. And what it does happen that with threat of bombing, the movement stops, and the repression becomes much larger and does not allow this grassroots to develop properly.
What I'm uncertain about is how we can best help people inside Iran to force the government to be more democratic, and how we can facilitate that process. That's a very difficult question. I know different people have different answers and different thinkings, but you don't want to let the government in Iran to have a free hand to do whatever they want against people. But on the other hand, democracy is not something that you can force from outside. And if there's a very strong democracy movement inside Iran, so if it looks like that people from outside are helping them, then the government will seize that opportunity to make it look like they're just foreign puppets, and it will crack down on them. So you cannot directly support them. But so that's the difficult question, and how best we can do something to help people inside Iran.
Khomeini did form a new kind of government with some elected offices, but still with himself as the supreme leader, the head of the government. There is an elected parliament called the Majlis and an elected president, but their democratic functions are limited, as all candidates and all laws must be approved by the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council has 12 members, and half are clerics appointed by the supreme leader, who has the final say on all important matters. The job of the Guardian Council is to guard the country against efforts to undermine the ideals of the revolution. They normally prevent any reformers from being elected, but the strength of the democracy movement culminated in 1997, and a reformer was elected.
Only Khatami! Salam!
From 1997 to 2005, a reformer named Khatami was the president of Iran. 70% of Iran is 30 years old or younger, due to Khomeini's urging people to have children at the start of the revolution, and losing many of the older generation in the Iran-Iraq War. He won the election, in large part due to support from women and the country's youth, who pressed their parents to vote for him. He wanted to return rights to women, and he rejected the idea that the Muslim world and the West must have a clash of civilizations, promoting instead a dialogue among civilizations. And like the US, the reformers can be undermined by more powerful interests. Khatami's reforms mostly failed, and when the conservatives used political assassinations of students and writers to destabilize the reformists, the people took to the streets in protest, and Khatami's response was silence and deference to the conservatives. His supporters began to turn against him. Khatami's reformist presidency was also undermined by the US, despite gestures of goodwill towards America from the people and the government of Iran.
Iran has the most pro-American public in the region, in the Middle East. If you remember, after September 11th, people just went to the streets and they had candlelight vigils for victims of the terrorist attacks. So people in Iran really like Americans.
In addition to candlelight vigils in the streets of Tehran, Iran's supreme leader condemned the mass killings of 9/11 and compared them to the genocide in Hiroshima and Bosnia. Then, when the US invaded Afghanistan, Iran had a mutual interest for stability. They helped to oust the Taliban and to get the warlords that controlled the country outside of the capital to cooperate with the new US-backed president, Hamid Karzai. Indeed, without Iran's tacit approval, the Afghani government could not take hold. In 2002, when Bush named Iran as part of the Axis of Evil, it came as a shock to Iran. In 2003, when Bush invaded Iraq, it was obvious where things were headed, and it was less of a surprise that he rejected Iran's offer to give in to U.S. demands on all outstanding issues in exchange for guarantees of security. The Bush administration has no interest in a more democratic Iran. If they wanted to help Iran's democracy movement, they would have helped the reformers by accepting the offer, and they certainly wouldn't have designated Iran as part of the Axis of Evil. In 2005, enough people shifted support to the hardliners to put Ahmadinejad in office. A former mayor of Tehran, He had a reputation for being incorruptible and was the first non-cleric to win. He campaigned as a man of the people who promised economic prosperity for the poor masses. His main opponent, Rafsanjani, was a wealthy moderate cleric, and the reformers didn't dare run in elections that year. Many reformers even became anti-US. The US further helped the hardliners by getting the population to rally behind them on the nuclear energy program for peaceful civilian use, an inalienable right guaranteed to them by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty is a treaty that was signed in the late 1960s, and its aim was to curb what we call the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons. In other words, countries that heretofore had not had nuclear weapons power status would not themselves develop nuclear weapons. It was a bargain between the nuclear powers at the time, France, England, the United States, Russia, and China, and what we call the nuclear have-nots, that in return for them having the ability to develop civilian nuclear power, they would not use that technology and know-how to develop nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon states themselves were pledged under Article 6 of the treaty to themselves undertake vigorous programs towards disarming their nuclear arsenal. Those nuclear weapon states have failed in their part of the bargain, and they've held on to their arsenal, setting a very terrible example for the rest of the world. For example, with the United States, while we're admonishing Iran to make their processes open, to not become a nuclear weapons power, that right now our government is proposing that we rev up the Department of Energy facilities to develop a new arsenal of nuclear warheads, which are called the Reliable Replacement Warheads. This project, which is projected to cost in the hundreds of millions of dollars, represents new nuclear weapons. And it's a shame that our government is actually taking the lead in starting a new nuclear arms race. It is actually our government with the largest nuclear arsenal that should be taking the lead in disarmament and to set by example the path that other countries should take.
Violated its NPT obligations, continuing to develop new weapons, including those intended for use against Iran. Also, the US gives a pass to its allies, Israel, India, and Pakistan. None of them are signatories to the NPT. And yet the US supports development of their nuclear weapons program. Given Iran's vast oil reserves, many question the need for them to pursue peaceful nuclear energy, but there are valid reasons, as the US must have recognized when Iran was an ally under the Shah, and the US pushed for Iran's nuclear development program, correctly arguing that oil will eventually run out. It is more profitable to export the oil, especially in the future when the price goes up. Also, even though Iran has plenty of crude oil, it lacks refineries. Sanctions has meant no major investment in the oil and gas sector, and the country still hasn't been able to recover enough to keep up with demand from the destruction of refinery capacity during the Iran-Iraq War. With its huge population growth and expanding industrialization, Iran actually relies on imports for refined oil. Then there is the matter of national prestige and pride. As a country that is a regional power, it will not give up its inalienable right under the NPT to have a nuclear program for peaceful use. How would Americans feel if our right to nuclear energy and research was taken away?
We live in a world where there are a lot of pressures to compete in what I would consider the world capitalist system. Pressures that in terms of the Iranian leadership and trying to jockey for world position that they look for. And part of this is what has unfortunately been the path, in my view, that other countries have taken as well, is to look for being able to potentially have status in the world and to develop a nuclear program. I don't know if that's where the Iranians are headed, but the potential is there.
Lastly, Iran likely wants the option to be able to build a nuclear deterrent on short notice if needed, just like Japan and dozens of other countries. Iran placed its confidence in the UN and international community to protect it at the start of the Iran-Iraq War, when Saddam Hussein crossed the border and invaded it. But the UN stood by and did nothing, even when it became clear Hussein was using chemical weapons against the Iranian resistance. Iran understands that it must be able to protect itself.
I look at the rest of the region, and I look at whether they wanted to have a nuclear weapon, which, as I understand it, they're not actually developing a nuclear weapon right now. But if they did, even though I'm against nuclear weapons, all nuclear weapons, I can understand the logic of deterrence. I see India, I see Pakistan, I see Israel, I see they're at odds with their neighbor and nearby neighbor Saudi Arabia. And then I look at North Korea barely having a bomb and delivery systems and the United States not going at war with them. It looks like, from Iran's perspective, in my mind, that they would think that they should have a nuclear weapon. And yet, polls there show that they want to have the right to it, as any other country would have a right to nuclear energy. But it's not clear that they're developing nuclear weapons, though I would understand why they would if they were.
While holding the option to develop nuclear weapons if needed, there are good reasons why Iran would hope not to have to exercise that option. The last thing it wants to do is alienate neighboring Arab countries, who might align with the US if they feel threatened by knowing Iran has nuclear weapons. It would strengthen the US position and undermine Iran's regional influence. The Iranian government may not be lying when it says it has no intent to build weapons, as it has said consistently throughout the US campaign to portray this official enemy as an unreasonable, unrelenting threat to the world. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has declared repeatedly that Iran will not attack or threaten any country. He has also issued a fatwa against production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons, and banned nuclear weapons as sacrilegious. Iran has been a consistent supporter of the NPT and called for a nuclear weapons-free Middle East. Under U.S. pressure, the UN Security Council ordered Iran to stop enriching uranium and has imposed sanctions without justification. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, is in charge of monitoring the nuclear programs of all countries. The IAEA is supposed to work with countries to resolve issues and report them to the UN Security Council if they cannot be assured that a country has not diverted nuclear material for non-peaceful use. If that happens, the Security Council can then decide to impose sanctions or use force. In the case of Iran, there is no evidence that Iran is building or even intends to build nuclear weapons. The IAEA director, Dr. El-Baradei, has consistently confirmed that there has been no diversion of safeguarded nuclear materials in Iran.
I have been concerned by hearing a lot of talks about use of force. I think that's, in my view, very counterproductive. What we have seen on the ground in Iran that are issues that need to be clarified. I said again, Iran needs to build confidence through suspending its enrichment-related activities. But that has been said. I have repeated that we have not seen any undeclared facilities operating in Iran. We have seen any concrete evidence that the Iran program is being weaponized. We have not received any information to that effect. So I haven't heard any other information to the contrary. So while we're still concerned about the nature of the Iranian program, we should not, I do not believe at this stage that we are facing clear and present danger that require that we go beyond diplomacy.
He has also repeatedly urged skeptics in Western capitals to help the IAEA by sharing any possible proof in their possession of suspicious nuclear activity in Iran. But the only proof offered has been proven false. The U.S. instead relies on coercion to get the UN and international agencies to serve the U.S. agenda.
The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work.
And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest. And if you don't like that, I'm sorry, but that is the fact.
India was told there would be no U.S.-India nuclear deal if they did not vote against Iran at the IAEA. Mistrust of Iran is based on the fact that Iran developed reactors in secret for 18 years. The U.S. offers this as evidence that Iran has something to hide, but the undeclared work was justified given the U.S. campaign to undermine any effort to develop out in the open. Iran learned that their contracts with countries like Germany and China would be canceled under U.S. pressure. Thus, Washington systematically violated, with impunity, Article 4 of the NPT, which allows signatories of the fullest possible exchange of equipment, materials, and scientific technological information for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. There are solutions to the transparency issues, such as putting all the world's nuclear energy production and distribution under international control. But since this doesn't give the U.S. control, such proposals are dismissed. We are left with escalation disguised as diplomacy, where U.S. offers to negotiate with Iran require that terms of the negotiation be conceded before the talks can even begin. Washington is not afraid of Iran becoming a nuclear threat anytime soon. Misleading the American public to believe otherwise is a pretext for war. But there are some things Washington does fear. Due to historical accident, most of the world's petroleum is in Shiite parts of the Middle East, including Shia-controlled Iraq, Shia Iran, and the Shia region of Saudi Arabia. Washington's worst nightmare is the formation of an independent, loose Shiite alliance, controlling most of the world's oil, possibly even joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, linked to the Asian energy security grid. U.S. economic rivals China and Russia are members, and Iran is an observer. The U.S., however, is shut out. Also, Saudis and Japanese are holding financial reserves in U.S. dollars, propping up the U.S. economy. If the energy grid expands, they may diversify, causing the value of the dollar to plummet. The economic problems for the U.S. could be huge. There are accusations that Iran is supporting terrorism.
When we're talking about questions of sponsoring terrorism, I think we have to pull back a little bit and really ask what do we mean by terrorism? If we're looking at it from the standpoint of one definition, which is armed groups targeting civilians and causing innocent people to die for whatever reason that motivates them, there are indications that indeed Iran might be providing some support to groups who would undertake those type of actions. On the other hand, many of these same groups themselves have legitimate political grievances in terms of the ongoing situation in the Middle East, in terms of the situation, for example, in Israel and Palestine, where people are deprived of their rights. So if we look historically at the issue of terrorism, it can be said in many circumstances that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. We could certainly look at the history of South Africa, for example, to see where Nelson Mandela and the members of the African National Congress were painted as terrorists, and now we recognize their contributions to freedom in their country. Compared with this issue, we also have to look at what the experience of our country has been and what we have both directly and indirectly supported, which could equally be looked at as terrorism. So we can look at the fact of the wars in Central America of the 1980s, where we backed death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador, and we backed the counter-revolution in Nicaragua, all which targeted innocent people, which propagated severe human rights abuses, including torture on many of these people. We could look also going back to Africa in terms of the United States' cooperation with South Africa in suppressing the frontline regimes in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Countries that at the beginning had a real chance to make real change in their countries in the post-colonial era, but because of our interest in countering Soviet power during the time of the Cold War, we backed the most ruthless mercenaries, and millions of people died. The consequences of those types of policies, which are equivalent to what the carnage wrought by terrorism, has been, for example, in Africa, countries that are awash with arms, that our country permits small arms, hundreds of thousands to flood places like Africa, where the really terrible wars in places like Sierra Leone and other countries in West Africa flourish. So again, we really have to look at the responsibility going across many different countries in this case, and in particular, since we're here in the United States, to look at the prime responsibility of our country being the strongest superpower in the world is basically dictating the course of action for much of the way the rest of the world runs.
Add this to the double hypocrisy of the U.S., one for complaining about Iran interfering in Iraq. And two for U.S. sponsorship of terrorism in Iran. The U.S. Congress authorized tens of millions to promote democracy in Iran, which has meant using clandestine operations to stir up ethnic conflicts, funding and arming military groups and ethnic separatists to cause havoc and destabilization, with hopes that it will instigate a revolt. These are the same accusations being made against Iran. The new direction in U.S. policy is yet another imperialist tradition of divide and rule by funding and inciting region-wide sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia. Further evidence that terrorism is not a priority to the U.S. policy planners is that they are funding militant Sunni Arabs in the region that are anti-U.S. and pro-Al-Qaeda to check the Shia power in Iran and Iraq. As long as there is conflict, the U.S. can justify its military presence. The U.S. has also taken more direct confrontation with Iran in preparation for war. An attack force has been sent to the Gulf with aircraft carriers waiting for orders to start bombing on 24 hours' notice. The first was the USS Eisenhower, named after the man responsible for the last time the U.S. overthrew their government. U.S. forces have Iran surrounded on both sides, occupying Iraq and Afghanistan. Under U.S. pressure, they are isolated from the international community. The U.S. has sent over 100 long-range jet bombers to Israel. This was advertised in the Israeli press for Iranian intelligence to know that they are capable of hitting Iran, as they did in Iraq to bomb the Osirak nuclear reactor. The threats alone made by the U.S. are illegal, as the UN Charter prohibits threat or use of force. But if this war happens, it may differ from Iraq in the sense that Iraq was a planned invasion from the beginning. Iran is a game of chicken that could turn into a war. Each side thinks it has the upper hand and believes if it can hold out, it will be in a better position to negotiate, forcing the other side to back down. But neither side seems willing to back down. The U.S. is overconfident because it scared Europe onto its side and now has unified support across the board. Developing countries, especially India and Brazil, are aligned with the U.S. and will vote with it at the UN. Even Democrats at home are on board, with all the leading presidential candidates stating, "A nuclear Iran is intolerable," and "All options are on the table."
There is a consensus. This is perhaps the most serious problem. There's a near consensus among the policy leaders in Washington, both Democrats and Republicans, that are encouraging the war fever with Iran. You have people like Barack Obama, who just recently said that all options are on the table with respect to Iran. Those are the magic words. Those are the magic words that every front-running candidate has to use to please AIPAC, the American-Israeli lobby. So they have to say those words. Well, they don't understand that those words have dramatic implications in the Middle East. That we can't, if we keep rattling these sabers, we are encouraging instability.
As Mike Gravel said the other night in the debate among the Democrats, he said, look, no option off the table means a code word for a nuclear attack on Iran.
We still have to make it clear that Iran having a nuclear weapon is absolutely unacceptable. We have to try to prevent that at all costs.
I think no president, no responsible president would ever take any option off the table.
Iran is an adversary. Their pursuit of nuclear weapons poses a grave threat to us.
The Iranian government is overconfident because the country is solidly behind it, mobilized on the nuclear issue. Most government critics would self-censor during a confrontation. Their government also knows it could turn Iraq from a quagmire to a nightmare. It understands that if attacked, it could close off the 20-mile wide Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, where most of the world's oil tankers must pass through. Oil prices would double overnight, devastating economies around the world. And not least, it knows that most Americans are against Bush and don't want war with Iran. So the danger is that the situation will escalate. The U.S. goes to the UN for sanctions, expecting Iran to back down. Iran sees this as in the tradition of imperial ultimatums, knowing that those who give in are seen as traitors, and those who stand up to the U.S. are seen as heroes. Iran withdraws from the NPT and proceeds full steam ahead with the nuclear program. The U.S. and/or Israel might then have limited airstrikes, claiming it will only be a few days with no civilians targeted, thinking then that Iran will back down. Or we might see a much larger bombing campaign, especially since we don't know where all the hidden nuclear sites reside, and since there is an expressed interest in taking out the entire Iranian military. The result would be mass destruction of the country, countless innocent lives, and a new generation of jihadi freedom fighters. Again, this is not a big problem for Washington. Iran's response would not be to directly attack the U.S. or Israel, knowing it would mean the instant destruction of Iran. Instead, it would likely hit back where it has the upper hand, in Iraq and Afghanistan. The only way to triple the number of U.S. troops is by reinstituting the draft. So what should the U.S. do instead of escalating war?
We should not allow to become numb to the suffering of ordinary people. We should not allow killing by just blink of an eye. It's very important to lead by an example. I personally believe that the U.S. ought to lead the entire world by an example. Resolving all global issues through persuasion, not fear. Through cooperation, not confrontation.
In the First World War, the major casualties were combatant soldiers. But as the wars have increased over the years, the major casualties, the major loss of life, have been non-combatants, have been civilians. And therefore, I don't think one can anymore justify wars unless it's absolutely necessary as a defense because your country's being attacked. There's a wonderful phrase by Howard Zinn, and he said, "No flag is large enough to cover the shame of innocent people killed in war." And I think that's really what we have to keep in mind. That has to be what motivates us to stop these goddamn wars.
A war would be unjustified, first off, because there are many other ways to try to deal with the situation in Iran without going to war. So we have international mechanisms such as having mutual support from the nuclear weapons powers and from the nuclear wannabes to be able to work the issue of the Iranian nuclear program out through diplomacy and, again, by having mutuality in terms of respect for the treaty, whereby the nuclear weapons powers would lead by example.
And sanctions, even, which is not diplomacy. Sanctions are an offensive act that will not bring reduced tension. The United States, has used nuclear weapons. We are violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We are violating, I think, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We are on the verge of wiping out international law as a basis for governments in conflict not going to war.
We have over 10,000 nuclear weapons. We have by far and away the largest military in the world, and we think we're exceptional. We think that we are not bound by international law, and history tells us that every country that treats itself as exceptional eventually gets into big trouble. The Germans thought they were exceptional. Before that, the British thought they were exceptional. And over again, governments and peoples that think that they are the chosen one, that the laws of international conventions don't apply to them, eventually they do get their comeuppance. We have to become less exceptional in our attitudes towards these countries and a little bit more appreciative of their history. That has not happened. Unfortunately, that's going to require a significant change of consciousness.
We can end the threat to the U.S. if we end the threat we make to others. We must end the U.S. threat to Iran. End the sanctions. Live up to our end of the NPT and stop developing new weapons. And reduce the ones we have. Sit down and negotiate. But in order to achieve a lasting solution against imperialist aggression, both our own and any powers that arise in the future, sooner or later, we need to have fundamental changes in support of international law and justice. We should make the UN Security Council a rotating body with no permanent members, not allow any country to have veto powers, and we need to accept the authority of the World Court. Intervention should only be allowed according to the rules of international law set by the UN. The US should withdraw from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the rest of the Middle East and pay reparations. We should end US contracts so Iraqis can rebuild Iraq. We should help Israel and Palestine achieve peace by not vetoing the UN resolution to return to pre-1967 borders. We must renounce the U.S. strategy of global military and economic empire.
There's a dynamic that's going on in the Middle East of what I would refer to as two outmodeds clashing with each other. An outmoded form of politics and economy from the West, in other words, empire or imperialism, clashing with an outmoded form of politics and ideology in countries like Iraq and Iran and so on, which is Islamic fundamentalism. Neither one of them really offer a future to the people either in this country or in the Middle East, in my view. And yet, in their clash, they actually reinforce each other. A U.S. attack on Iran, and if Iran responded or stood up in any way, would greatly fuel this. Many millions of people, even secular people, would feel compelled to support Islamic fundamentalism simply to oppose this horror that they're seeing coming from the United States. And it's my view that we have to create a third way. I mean, one of the things I think is so important about people in this country resisting is that it sets an example for people across the world that it's possible to have an alternative to imperialism that is not simply based on religious fundamentalism. I understand that this system that we live in is riven with contradictions, that it's in motion and that it may seem all-powerful, but has very many fault lines within it. And those can erupt with very little warning. In Iran in 1978, Jimmy Carter said Iran, the Shah, was an island of stability in a troubled world. A year later, he was fleeing for his life, and a quarter of the population, 10 million people, were in the streets protesting. This came from nowhere, but it seemed to come from nowhere, but it came from these deep fissures and fault lines, contradictions within the existing order. So it is possible for a big resistance and a revolutionary or progressive movement to come forward. So I think that creating that kind of resistance in this country, starting with driving out this Bush regime and repudiating its program, impeaching Bush and Cheney, I think would open up an enormous amount of political space for people all around the world, including in Iran.
Although the current regime in Iran is undemocratic, if we truly believe in democracy, we must let the Iranian people change their own country over time. As a test of fairness, we might imagine that Iran invaded and occupied Canada and Mexico and had aircraft carriers sitting in the Caribbean. Imagine then if Iran had the power to label the US the axis of evil and cut us off from the rest of the world, and then threatened to attack us if we didn't stop generating nuclear power. What if Iran had overthrown the US government 50 years ago and installed a dictator friendly to Iranian interests, who kept it in power for 25 years? At that point, imagine that Christian fundamentalists, who currently represent about a third of the US, took power and began ruling under church law, followed by an unprovoked invasion by Canada, supported by Iran and ignored by the UN, in which it nearly destroyed the US. Would it be possible to imagine Iran as liberators? Would Iran be justified in attacking if the US government helped Christian fundamentalists in Canada to take up resistance? Would it be justified to hate and fear all Christians because of the ones that took and abused power in this context? This is not about good guys and bad guys. Both the American and Iranian governments are working against the interests of the people. But the deadly game of chicken was begun by the US, and the US has the power to end it. We should look at our current policies and actions against Iran, look at some better options, and figure out a way to change the minds of the people running our government and prevent another criminal enterprise that will cost many more lives. It has been done in the past, and if people take action, it can be done again. My name is Sahar Driver. I'm an Iranian American living in the Bay Area. I'm in the doctoral program in a post-colonial anthropology program.
My name is Mitchell Plitnick. I was born in New York City, grew up there. I live in Alameda, California, and I am the Director of Education and Policy for Jewish Voice for Peace.
My name is Jim Haber. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've been helping run a soup kitchen for the last 21 years, full-time for 13, providing service as well as advocacy and organizing.
My name is Bob Gould. I grew up in the Bronx, and for the last 30 years I've lived in San Francisco. I work at Kaiser Hospital in San Jose as a pathologist, where I've worked there since 1981. I'm also, since 1989, the president of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility.
My name's Antonia Juhas, and I live in San Francisco. I'm an activist and an author. I'm a fellow with Oil Change International, a visiting scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and I am the author of a book called The Bush Agenda: Invading the World One Economy at a Time.
My name is David Glick. I live in Fairfax, California, a small town in Marin County. I work as a psychotherapist. I've been doing that for about 30 years, and I spend a lot of time doing political activism of different kinds around social justice and peace issues. And in my spare time, I write poetry.
My name is Majid Barida, born in Tehran, Iran. I've been here in the United States last 35 years, and for last 28 years I've been a U.S. citizen. My profession is civil and earthquake engineering that spans over 26 years.
I'm Larry Everest. I'm from Berkeley, California. I've been covering the Middle East and Central Asia for over 25 years for Revolution newspaper and other publications, and I'm the author of Oil, Power, and Empire, Iraq, and the U.S. Global Agenda, and other books.
My name is Mike Valuva. I'm an attorney. I'm in private practice in Walnut Creek. I am also counsel to the Western States Legal Foundation, which is a peace and environmental foundation based in Oakland, California.
My name is Shahab Laegi. I'm originally from Iran. I immigrated to the United States about 15 years ago, and I've been a citizen for the past 3.5 years. I'm an engineer. I'm a software engineer. I live in Redwood City, California. It's in the Bay Area. And